Okay, so actually the recorder cut off there for a minute, so I'm just going to continue where we were left off in this next video. And again, I just kind of left off here where we're looking at Schiff's Chicago plant, right? He manufactures the product, controls the transportation, the railway, the refrigerated boxcars, creates a marketing and advertising company, or department, not a company, as part of his massive kind of corporation that's emerging, and then the final retail distribution toward the market. And again, this is an example of vertical integration toward the market. And then we're going to see another example of vertical integration toward the market, and that is in specifically the cigarette industry. Now, the cigarette industry, similar to the meatpacking industry, as I said, is vertically integrated toward the market. But what's interesting in their case is if we look at the meatpacking industry, part of the problem was continuous production, right? They had this continuous assembly line of production. As a result of that, they had to find customers and new customers that were willing to buy their product, right? They had to aggressively market. They had to make sure that people understood that shipping meat 100 miles across or hundreds of miles across the country was safer or just as safe as buying it from your local butcher. And of course, it was cheaper because it was mass produced. Now, in the case of the tobacco industry, they have a similar but not exactly the same problem. So if we look at James Buchanan Duke here, okay, he is the son of the founder of his specific company, which is founded by his father, a man named Washington Duke, in 1865. But by the 1870s, the company was mostly run by Washington Duke's son, James Buchanan Duke. Now, in the early 1880s, he acquired the first automatic cigarette rolling machine. And now this allowed him to basically roll 200 cigarettes per minute. This was the equivalent of what one person could do in 10 hours. And it lowered production costs by about 50%. But it also created him a problem. On the one hand, it was great that he could produce 200 cigarettes a minute. But now all of a sudden he had all these cigarettes that he had to figure out what to do with, right? So similar to what Swift does, he creates a marketing and advertising department. But what's a little bit different in the case of James Duke is he's concerned with overproduction, whereas Swift was concerned with the continuous production process. So now all of a sudden, there's all of these cigarettes that he has to sell. So what he does is he sets up an advertising department. He moves the headquarters to New York, and he manufactures the demand through manipulative ads appealing to young men, right? This is when the advertising industry was born, right? Smoke cigarettes, you'll look cool. I mean, they wouldn't have used the term cool in the late 19th century, but this was the idea. Baseball cards. The emergence of baseball cards is directly tied to advertising and marketing pioneered by the cigarette and tobacco companies, specifically James Buchanan Duke, right? This association of when you bought a cigarette pack, you got baseball cards, right? So it was ingrained not only in American popular culture, but this idea of appealing to young men through manipulative advertising, right? These advertisements all made men look more manly and masculine if you smoked this particular brand of cigarette. This is what James Duke was doing. And again, this is an example of vertical integration toward the market. Right? He's producing something he has too much of. He has to manufacture the demand. Up until this point, most Americans' tobacco consumption was either through pipe smoking, chewing tobacco, maybe cigars, but mostly pipe smoking and chewing tobacco. Cigarettes were a new product. So even more so in the case of Swift. Swift is introducing a product that people are familiar with, but they're less familiar with his production process. They're not as comfortable, at least initially, of buying things, meat that came from hundreds of miles away. But the product itself was something people recognized. In the case of James Duke, this was a brand new product. This was a new product that people had never used before. So the demand had to be manufactured in the case of James Duke. And then again, that was the emergence of mass advertising. And again, this form of vertical integration is toward the market and dealing with problems of the continuous production process and overproduction. Now, the next example of vertical integration we're going to look at is the opposite. It's away from the market toward production. And the pioneer of this form of vertical integration, the best example, is the steel industry, specifically a man named Andrew Carnegie. Now, Andrew Carnegie is one of the few people that can actually be considered a self-made man. Most people that we say are self-made are actually not self-made, depending on how you define self-made. Mark Zuckerberg is a really good example, right? He's often touted as a self-made billionaire. Yeah, that's true. His parents weren't billionaires, but they were millionaires, right? His father was a successful dentist. His mother was a successful Manhattan lawyer. He went to Phillips Exeter Academy, which is one of the most expensive private high schools in the United States. Probably cost more than his Harvard education. So yes, self-made billionaire, but was launched from two millionaires, right? So not exactly the same thing. Andrew Carnegie is somebody who actually started with nothing when he came from Scotland to the United States in the mid-19th century. And he got his big break when he worked as a personal telegrapher for the superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Here he learned about how important it was to have information and control of production costs. He invested some of his salary in the railroad and earned about $56,000 a year from his investments. That's a lot of money in the late 1800s. Now, the early 1870s, he began building his own steel business, and his philosophy was simple: cut costs and profits will take care of themselves. But the key thing that Carnegie was known for was vertical integration toward production. And again, here I'll show you this Homestead steel as an example here. So again, vertical integration, just to reiterate, is when you buy and control different industries that are part of your production process. This allows you to control all aspects of the manufacturing process. Essentially, it allows you to control your costs better. So in the case of steel, it means mining and smelting of ore and the selling of steel rails. Because think about it. If you were not controlling all those costs, if you had other companies that were involved in the mining industry, if you were buying say raw material from a mine, it had to be paid on a separate company that was shipping it and a railroad company that was also shipping it, well, they had to make a profit as well, right? So this allowed him to control his costs much better. But that wasn't the key motivation for doing it, right? That was kind of a good byproduct for somebody like Andrew Carnegie, who was obsessed with controlling costs. Part of what it was ensuring access to raw materials. And again, this was part of the problem of a continuous production process. So, for example, this is how it worked. This is Homestead Steel, right? They make steel. So what Carnegie does is he buys up the iron mine in the Mesaba Range, which is in, I think, northern Michigan. Then he buys a fleet of freighters to ship it through the Great Lakes. Then he buys the railway that the freighters take it to bring it directly to Homestead Steel. And he does the same thing with the other ingredient that is necessary in the manufacturing of steel, which is coal. So he buys coal fields in West Virginia and Alabama. He buys the railroad companies to ship it directly from those coal deposits to his plant in Homestead, which is near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, right? So again, you can see this is vertical integration backward toward production, whereas the tobacco and meatpacking companies was forward toward the market, right? So all of this vertical integration is going back to the production process. Now, if we look at an example here, as a map of the United States, here's how it worked. So this is Homestead Steel, right here, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This is where Andrew Carnegie's manufacturing steel. This is the Mesaba Range where he's getting all the iron from. So what he does is he buys this mine, and then he buys a fleet of lake freighters to transport all the iron through Lake Huron, through the St. Clair River, to Lake Erie, to about here. Then he buys a railway to ship it from Lake Erie to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where Homestead Steel is. And he does the same thing with coal, right? He buys up coal mines, coal deposits in northern Alabama and West Virginia, buys the railway so they can be sent to his plant in Homestead, or Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Now, again, what was key about this was ensuring access to raw materials. Yes, it helped him streamline and control the production costs, but the real motivation for the steel industry was a secure access to the materials you need to make your product. Because think about it, what if another steel company came in and started doing business with this mine or this mine here? What if the fleet of lake freighters got business from somebody else? Right? What if they started selling to somebody else, doing business with somebody else? This allowed them access to all aspects of production that was necessary for them to manufacture the finished product of steel. Because if that process was interrupted, if, for example, he had gone to a mine and said, well, this is how much steel this is how much iron we need for this particular month, this particular year, and the person said, well, I can't help you because I have contracts with these other steel companies. Now, all of a sudden, your production process is interrupted and things have to shut down. Right? So in many ways, the motivation to vertically integrate from the point of view of a steel company was defensive. It was about securing access to raw materials in the production process. And again, we'll just reiterate what this looked like specifically. Iron in the mine from the Mesaba Range, a fleet of ships to ship the product along the Great Lakes, to a railway in Pennsylvania, to Homestead Steel, and the same thing with the coal. Now, this is, again, an example of vertical integration backward toward production, as opposed to Duke and Swift, which was forward toward the market. Andrew Carnegie didn't have to manufacture the demand. And in fact, in the case of steel, their marketing departments were much smaller, largely because they weren't selling to the mass consumer public. When steel companies shifted after the railway boom, before the end of the railway boom, most of what Homestead Steel and Andrew Carnegie and other steel companies are selling to, their main market is the railway industry. Because think of it, if we go back to the slide that I had here with the railway, think of how much steel it requires to lay all these hundreds of thousands of miles of track. Well, this was the beginning of the early steel boom because the railway boom. But of course, after the railway boom starts to subside in the 1880s and the 1890s, they have to look for other markets. And the key market for Carnegie was the urban markets, buildings, all of these kind of massive cities that were being built, bridges, anything you can think of that requires steel, right? That's where the market was. But they didn't need a marketing department per se because there wasn't a need to manufacture demand. You weren't selling to the general public. You weren't trying to convince people why smoking cigarettes was cool or why buying your meat from a meat packer in Chicago if you lived in New York was safe. What you were doing was selling it to people where the demand was already built in. You didn't have to convince people that using steel to build a skyscraper was good business. They already knew that, right? So what the steel industry was mostly focused on was controlling their production costs and ensuring access to the raw material necessary to build their finished product, all right? So that's integration. I'm going to leave it there for a minute, and then now what we're going to look at finally is horizontal integration and the emergence of monopolistic companies.